Project Blue Book ran from 1952 to 1969. 17 years of official United States Air Force investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena, 12,618 case files, thousands of witness statements, radar logs, photographs, and physical evidence reports, all generated by a government program funded with taxpayer money and staffed by uniformed officers. When the program closed in 1969, the public was told the official conclusion: nothing found, no threat to national security, no evidence of anything extraordinary. A program that investigated for 17 years and supposedly discovered nothing worth keeping secret. And yet, the complete, unredacted case files from that program were not fully released to the American public until decades after the program closed, with full public digitization by the National Archives not completed until 2025. 57 years between the moment Project Blue Book stamped its final case closed and the moment any ordinary citizen could sit down and read the complete, unredacted record for themselves. But this is not the story you think it is. You are not about to hear that the records prove extraterrestrial visitation. I am not going to tell you that, because the documents themselves do not say that. What I am going to walk you through is something almost nobody discusses directly, and it is more interesting than the question of what the files contain. It is the question of why a government program that supposedly found nothing significant took longer to fully release its own paperwork than the Manhattan Project took to build the atomic bomb, fight a world war, and have most of its operational secrets declassified. 17 years of investigation. 57 years to open the file completely. That timeline gap is not a detail, it is the actual mystery. So here's the question that should bother you more than any single case file inside that archive. If there was truly nothing to hide, what specifically took 57 years? There is a documented principle in declassification studies, the academic field that studies how and why governments release or withhold historical records, called the classification half-life problem. It's a real area of research, published in journals on national security archives and information policy. The principle states that the duration a government keeps a record classified correlates more strongly with the sensitivity of the underlying subject matter, or the existence of related ongoing programs, than with any fixed retention schedule. In other words, when something takes far longer to declassify than comparable records from the same era, the standard explanation of routine bureaucratic timelines stops holding up, and researchers start asking what else might be connected. That's not speculation. That's a documented analytical framework used by historians who study classified American records professionally, including those who worked with the National Security Archive at George Washington University, specifically on UAP-related document releases. Now here's the detail that should not exist if Blue Book genuinely found nothing. In 1969, when Blue Book officially closed, the Air Force's own closing rationale cited a study conducted by the University of Colorado, commonly known as the Condon Report, which concluded further investigation was not scientifically justified. That part is fact, on the record. What is also fact, and far less discussed, is that the same year Blue Book closed, the CIA was separately maintaining classified files on aerial phenomena that were never part of Blue Book's official record at all, confirmed by CIA documents released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act, available right now through the National Security. I kept investigating what actually happened to the Blue Book files between that 1969 closure and their eventual full release, and the gap itself turned out to be more revealing than I expected. The Blue Book case files were physically transferred to the National Archives in 1976, 7 years after the program closed. That transfer is documented. But transfer to the National Archives does not mean public access. Records transferred to the archives can remain restricted, partially redacted, or accessible only through formal in-person requests for years or decades, depending on the classification review process attached to them. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, researchers and journalists filing FOIA requests for specific Blue Book cases report receiving documents with sections redacted, citing ongoing national security review for files about a program the government said in 1969 had concluded nothing. In 2015, the National Archives began a microfilm digitization initiative, making scanned versions of the case files available online for the first time, decades after the original investigation closed. Even that 2015 release was not the complete archive. Additional administrative records, cross-reference classified material, and supplementary investigative files continued being processed and added incrementally, with the National Archives confirming full digitized public access was not completed until 2025. Let me be precise here about fact versus hypothesis versus speculation. Because this is exactly the kind of story where that precision protects you from being misled in either direction. Facts. Project Blue Book operated from 1952 to 1969 and generated 12,618 case files, officially closed citing the Condon Report's conclusions. CIA documents confirmed via FOIA release show parallel classified files on the same general subject matter that were never part of Blue Book's official record. The case files were transferred to the National Archives in 1976, online digitization began in 2015, and full public digitized access was not completed until 2025. Hypotheses supported by circumstantial evidence that the extended incremental release timeline reflects an ongoing classification review process tied to material connected to other, still sensitive programs rather than the Blue Book file's own content alone. That the gap between officially closed in 1969 and fully public in 2025 represents administrative entanglement with other classified material rather than anything specifically incriminating within Blue Book itself. Speculation without solid factual basis. That the 57-year delay was a deliberate decision to hide evidence of extraterrestrial contact contained specifically within these files. I have no verifiable evidence supporting that specific claim and will not present it as fact. Now think about what this timeline actually tells you once you set it next to comparable historical releases. The Venona Project, the United States' top-secret World War II and Cold War-era Soviet cryptography decryption program, one of the most sensitive counterintelligence operations in American history, was substantially declassified and released to the public in 1995, roughly 50 years after the underlying intelligence work began in the 1940s. That is one of the most genuinely consequential secrets the United States government has ever held, involving actual espionage networks, real Soviet agents, real Cold War stakes, and it reached substantial public release on a similar or shorter timeline than the complete release of a UFO research program the government insists found nothing. If a program that found nothing takes as long, or longer, to fully release as a program that uncovered actual active espionage networks during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, something about that comparison does not sit right, and it is fair to ask why. I know what you might be thinking right now. Bureaucracies are simply slow. Government archives have limited resources. Digitization takes time and money, and the absence of malicious intent is the simplest explanation for a long timeline. And you would be right that bureaucratic slowness is real and well documented in general. Here is what that explanation does not account for. The documented existence of the separate CIA classified files running in parallel to Blue Book, confirmed by FOIA release, means this was never simply one program's paperwork sitting in a single slow queue. It means Blue Book's records were administratively connected to a broader web of classified material from a different agency, and broader administrative entanglement is exactly the kind of factor that extends release timelines for reasons that have nothing to do with simple funding shortages, and everything to do with how connected files get reviewed together rather than separately. But there is a question almost nobody asks when they look at this story, and it changes how you should think about everything you've just heard. The question is not, what is in the files that they don't want us to see? That framing assumes a single withheld secret sitting inside Blue Book itself, waiting to be found. The question that actually matters is this: what does it mean that the American public's access to information about a closed government program was never determined primarily by the program's own findings, but by its administrative connections to other classified material the public still cannot fully map? If that's true, then the real subject of this video has never been UFOs specifically. It's about how the public's right to see its own government's closed historical record can be delayed for over half a century, not necessarily because of any single dramatic secret, but because the architecture of classification connects files to other files in ways ordinary citizens are never shown. In June 2023, during the same congressional hearings where David Grush testified under oath about non-human origin materials, lawmakers from both parties specifically raised the question of why historical UAP-related records, including older Blue Book-adjacent material, remained incompletely declassified after more than half a century. That questioning is on the congressional record. It is one of the only times in American history that sitting members of Congress have directly pressed military and intelligence officials on the record about why records from a program officially closed in 1969 were still not fully public in 2023. The officials testifying did not provide a complete timeline explanation. They acknowledged an ongoing review process. An ongoing review process for a program the public was told 54 years earlier had concluded nothing. And then I understood. The 57-year gap was never really a story about what Blue Book found. It was a story about how long the architecture of secrecy can outlive the program it was originally built to protect, simply because nobody is required to explain why the door stays closed after the room is supposedly empty. So what do you do with this? First, when evaluating any government's release of historical records, the actual signal worth tracking is not the content of what's released, it's the gap between official closure and full public access. A short gap suggests routine administration. A multi-decade gap, especially one involving incremental partial releases, suggests entanglement with material the public has not yet been shown the full map of. Second, the existence of parallel, unannounced classified programs running alongside a publicly known one is not unique to this case. It's a documented pattern in how governments compartmentalize sensitive subjects, and learning to ask what else was running alongside this is a transferable skill for evaluating any official historical narrative. Third, comparing declassification timelines across genuinely different programs, like Venona versus Blue Book, gives you an actual benchmark instead of an abstract feeling that something took too long. Benchmarks turn vague suspicion into a specific, answerable question. Fourth, congressional questioning on the record, even when it doesn't produce a complete answer, is itself documented evidence that the people with oversight authority also find the timeline unusual. That is worth more than speculation, because it means the question you're asking is the same one being asked inside the institution itself. So if there was nothing to hide, why did it take 57 years to open this file completely? The honest answer, built from what is actually documented, is this: because the file was never sitting alone. It was connected, administratively and historically, to other classified material from other agencies that the public still does not have a complete map of, and the timeline for opening any single file depends on the timeline for everything it's tangled up with. That is not proof of extraterrestrial contact. It is proof of something almost as significant in its own way: that the American public's access to its own government's closed historical record is not governed by what that record contains, but by what it remains connected to. The question that will stay with you after this video ends is the one Congress itself raised in 2023 and never fully answered. If Blue Book genuinely concluded nothing in 1969, what exactly has required 57 years of ongoing review to finish separating from everything it was never supposed to be tangled up with in the first place?